My name is Max Margulies. For those of you who have been with us for our earlier panels, this will not be new to you, but for those of you just joining us, I would just like to give you a friendly welcome to our USMA Class of 2006 War Studies Conference. Just a couple quick reminders before I pass the baton to our panelists. This meeting is being recorded. The views that you're about to hear are only those of the panelists and do not represent the views of the U.S. Military Academy, DoD, or any other U.S. agency. The moderators will be running the panel, so if you do have any questions, I do ask you to hold them until the end, and then you can raise your hand and the moderator will call on you. And if you're having any mic problems, you can, of course, type your question into the chat. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Tom Sherlock, to lead an exciting conversation about how the U.S. can coerce and deter Russia. Thanks, everyone.
Max, thanks very much, and greetings to everyone. So I am Tom Sherlock, a professor of political science here at West Point. I am grateful to the Modern War Institute for assembling this important conference, Coercion and Competition, How the United States Can Impose Costs and Disrupt Adversaries Without Resorting to War. A colleague from Russia just wrote to me with a comment on our elections and also the larger political environment. And he pointed out to me with his tongue firmly in his cheek that Russia should be valued for its domestic stability and strategic predictability. That may or may not be the case, but some of the issues we will address on this panel are what does sustained U.S. diplomacy toward Russia look like in the midst of so much global, regional, and national turbulence? What is the utility of American financial or economic coercive tools against Russia? How might we counter Russia's nuclear modernization program? How cohesive and durable is the alliance structure in its face-off with Russia, the U.S. alliance structure? And what are the goals of Russian information warfare? And how effective is our response to this particular threat? So to help answer these and other questions, we are fortunate to have a remarkable panel. And I would like to briefly introduce them. You can see their full bios in the brochure offered by the conference, and I strongly suggest that you read the bios in full. First, Thomas Graham is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also currently a senior advisor at Kissinger Associates, where he focuses on Russia and Eurasian affairs. He is a co-founder of the Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies program at Yale and sits on their faculty steering committee. He is also a research fellow at the Macmillan Center, also at Yale, where he teaches a course on U.S.-Russian relations. Dr. Graham also served in the past as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff. Cynthia Roberts is a professor of political science at Hunter College, City University of New York, senior research scholar at the Saltzman Center of War and Peace Studies at Columbia, and adjunct professor at Columbia. In 2019, with support of the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars, she worked as a policy advisor at the Joint Staff, Department of Defense in J5, Strategy, Plans, and Policy. Professor Roberts' research spans the military and financial statecraft of major powers. Her most recent book, The BRICS and Collective Financial Statecraft, was published by Oxford in 2018, and a Chinese edition is forthcoming. Alexander Lanoszka is an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Waterloo. His research agenda encompasses international security, alliance policies, theories of war, with a special focus on Central and Northeastern Europe. He has published articles in international security, international affairs, security studies, and the Non-Proliferation Review. His book, Atomic Assurance, The Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation at Cornell, examines how alliances can best deter and reverse efforts at nuclear proliferation by states that receive security guarantors from the United States. And Nina Jankowicz studies at the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. She is the author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict, published by Bloomsbury, IB Tauris. Ms. Jankowicz has advised the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other venues. She is a frequent television and radio commentator on disinformation and Russian and Eastern European affairs. Prior to her Fulbright grant in Ukraine, Ms. Jankowicz managed democracy assistance programs to Russia and Belarus at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. So we will start with the remarks of Dr. Graham. Tom Graham. I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Dr. Graham, you're okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction. And it is a real pleasure to be able to speak here on an important topic of Russia. Now, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that the most basic form of human stupidity is forgetting what we are trying to accomplish. And I can't help but think of that aphorism when I consider US-Russia policy today. What are we trying to do? Besides President Trump, there's a broad consensus that the United States needs to be tough, push back against aggressive Russian meddling in our domestic affairs, against Russian actions in Ukraine, and along the Russian-NATO frontier, against Russia's presence in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. And the favored tool for doing that is sanctions, which we have been levying with abandon since at least the eruption of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. But to what end? Are we simply trying to punish Russia for malign activities? Are we trying to impose costs and disrupt Russia, as a theme of this conference would suggest? Are we trying to change Russian behavior in ways that are advantageous to the defense and the advancement of American interests? Our rhetoric would indicate that we're trying to do all of these things. But what is striking to me is that for all the punishment we have meted out, for all the cost we have imposed, Russian behavior has remained largely unchanged. Russia continues to meddle in our domestic affairs with ever more refined tactics. It is consolidating its position in Crimea while destabilizing the rest of Ukraine. It remains ensconced in Syria. It continues to engage in provocative behavior along the NATO-Russian frontier. And I can go on, but I think we all get the point. Many would argue that the reason for that is that we have not punished Russia severely enough, that we have not imposed sufficient cost. And what they call for is ever more sanctions, confident that it's some, while ignoring Russia's capacity with its large nuclear arsenal and sophisticated cyber weapons to impose cost on the United States. This attitude is particularly prevalent in Congress and parts of the national media, and this constant call for further sanction reminds me of another aphorism, often wrongly attributed to Albert Einstein, but pertinent nevertheless to our discussion, and that is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If our goal is to change Russian behavior in ways compatible with our interests, and I would argue that is what our goal should be, then what has been missing from our policy is a clear articulation of what we are trying to do, why we are trying to do it, and why we believe we can achieve it. To develop an effective policy, we need answers to 5 questions. First, what is at stake in our relations with Russia? That is, what are our interests? Second, what does Russia believe is at stake? That is, how does Russia define its own interest? Third, what resources can we bring to bear to shape relations with Russia? Fourth, the analogous question for Russia, what resources can Russia bring to bear to shape relations? And finally, on the basis of the answers to those previous four questions, what is it possible to accomplish with Russia that will advance our interests at an acceptable cost and leave open the possibility of further advance as circumstances change? Our resources include, as you know, military power, economic sanctions, technological capabilities, cultural attraction, and diplomatic engagement, among other things. The statesman's task is to combine all those tools to produce the best outcome for his country. This we have not done, I would argue, with regard to Russia for some time. And the tool that has been missing has been serious, sustained diplomatic engagement, which we severed after the eruption of the Ukraine crisis. Now here, I need to stress 2 points that usually get lost in a discussion of renewed diplomatic engagement with Russia. First, such engagement would not be a reward for bad behavior, as many Americans seem to think. It is rather a way to send clear messages to the Russians about our goals and expectations, a way to deepen our understanding of their motives, goals, and red lines, and to give them a sense of our own to avoid the miscommunications that can turn a crisis into a military conflict that neither country wants. In short, renewed engagement is a way to enhance our security. Second, renewed engagement is not a return to business as usual. It is not a reset in relations, because it would not be grounded in a desire to build partnership, but rather in recognition that our two countries are competitors, deeply divided by views on world order, geopolitical interests, and values. To be sure, we need to cooperate to reduce the risk of nuclear catastrophe and to deal with urgent transnational challenges such as climate change. But most of the cooperation will really be about developing rules of the road to manage our competitions responsibly. That is, to reduce the risk of unwanted conflict. In other words, we need to cooperate to compete more safely. Now, if we think of diplomatic engagement in this way, it becomes clear that it can be integrated into a strategy not simply to impose costs on Russia, egregious conduct, but rather to alter Russia's cost-benefit calculus in a way that leads it to behavior that advances our interests. This is hardly a new idea. Indeed, this is the way the United States ran its policy towards the Soviet Union in the last decades of the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan, many of you may remember, was unstinting in his denunciation of Soviet communism, of the Soviet Union, which he considered an evil empire. His administration provided covert support to the Afghan Mujahideen in their resistance to Soviet invaders in the 1980s. It worked with the papacy to support the anti-communist labor union Solidarity in Poland. It bolstered insurgencies against Moscow-backed regimes in Africa and Central America. And at the same time, President Reagan engaged in an intense diplomatic effort with his Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, focused on strategic arms reductions and improving bilateral relations. And as Secretary of State, George Shultz pursued what he called problem solving with his Soviet foreign minister. And this diplomatic engagement was essential to ending the Cold War on terms usually beneficial to the United States. So in short, coercive power can support diplomacy. Diplomacy can diminish the need to resort to force or end the violence in specific disputes on acceptable terms and allow us to husband our resources for other challenges. This is the way sanctions and diplomacy should work. Now, this is not what we see today. Instead of targeted sanctions that can incrementally be eased in exchange for steps by Moscow that move negotiations towards acceptable conclusions, we had inflexible, congressionally mandated sanctions, often to punish Russia for ill-defined malign behavior, which can only be lifted with congressional approval. Since Moscow sees such sanctions as permanent, they have no incentive to change behavior. They have no faith that doing that will lead to the lifting of sanctions, and I would argue that they have good reason to feel that way. In the 1970s, Congress passed the so-called Jackson-Ivanek Amendment, which restricted Soviet trade with the United States because of Soviet restrictions on the free emigration of Soviet Jews. When the Soviet Union broke up and a new Russian state allowed free emigration, the amendment remained in place, at least on one occasion with which I am familiar, because Russia restricted the import of American chickens. So a sanction regime that was set up because Moscow would not let Jews out was retained because it would not allow chickens in. So what conclusion would you draw about the American sanctions regime if you were sitting in the Kremlin today? So we need to change. I was asked to look at the future, what we're going to do in the next administration. I am going to go out on a limb here and suggest that Joe Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th. I don't know whether his administration will be able to impose greater costs or better disrupt adversaries like Russia than the Trump administration has. What is to my mind possible and likely is that his administration will restore a functioning interagency process that should enable it to elaborate a more coherent policy towards Russia and to execute it in a more efficient and effective manner. I'm also inclined to believe that despite the rhetoric during the campaign, a Biden administration would be pragmatic and would combine all our elements of national power, including economic sanctions and diplomatic engagement, in an effort to achieve the optimal outcomes for the United States in our relations with Russia. And let me end there.
Dr. Graham, thank you very much. We now turn to Cynthia Roberts.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so first, thanks again to the organizers of this conference. And I want to repeat, I also only speak for myself, not for any branch of the government. I want to talk today principally about America's two foremost instruments of national power, our U.S. nuclear forces and the U.S. dollar and financial system. And as we all know, every American public strategy document released in the Trump years has highlighted the centrality of great power competition, including the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which clearly extends the centrality of that competition to the area of nuclear forces. Nuclear deterrence is, of course, the #1 priority mission of the DoD and the bedrock of U.S. national security. It's also the backbone of extended deterrence to our allies, which will be important, I would venture to say, in either administration. And extended deterrence must be able to deter, discourage, and if necessary, respond to any adversary's nuclear employment. I would say it's the most challenging mission of our nuclear force. Now, given our conference theme, the U.S. also, it's worth noting, the U.S. also wants to be able to show that nuclear weapons are part of an offset strategy to deny our adversaries any leverage from using their nuclear arsenals to negate overall U.S. conventional advantages, or from using them, their diverse array of military forces in their regions in the service of unilateral gains, or to deny American forces access to the Russian periphery in the event of Russian aggression. So although the focus here is on Russia, it also deserves mention that the U.S. is operating in a multipolar nuclear age with rising Chinese nuclear capabilities, North Korea, as noted in the previous session, Pakistani, and possibly others such as Iran. The absolute worst case for the United States in terms of both deterrence and coercion would be if there was collusion and coordination between nuclear allies of the United States. Nuclear adversaries of the United States, notably Russia and China, where there's already a deep partnership. And I hope in the discussion we can elaborate on this to some extent. Despite the post-Cold War reductions, the U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals still dwarf all of the other nuclear powers combined. And it's important to note that Russia is in the midst of a comprehensive modernization program and is not only ahead of the United States in recapitalizing its nuclear force, but also developing several new exotic nuclear weapons, including a hypersonic glide vehicle, a long-range nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile, and a deep-diving, fast unmanned multi-megaton nuclear-armed underwater vehicle or torpedo. Now, nuclear competitions, I think we can all realize, involving the United States are not new. During the Cold War, the U.S. effectively used an offset strategy that relied on U.S. advances in areas of advanced technology like microelectronics, intelligence, anti-submarine warfare, to ensure that it could significantly reduce damage from any Soviet first strike and even credibly threaten to neutralize the Soviet nuclear force with counterforce preemptive strikes if necessary to ensure extended deterrence. This offset strategy was one of the best examples of successful cost imposition in the Cold War. But it's worth and important to note that the nuclear competition is a dynamic process, and in the 1990s, despite the near collapse of the Russian economy, Moscow showed resilience and the determination to rebuild its nuclear capabilities and repaired their strategic vulnerabilities, as well as later on their economic issues. They also rebuilt their conventional forces as part of an all-domain posture. And the fruits of those efforts are reflected in Russia's own offset strategy, which was displayed, as I mentioned, in their new exotic nuclear weapons that President Putin revealed in March of 2018. Some of these new nuclear weapons augment their existing force and are not counted under New START. Some of them are designed to counter our missile defenses or forthcoming missile defenses and seem to reflect Russian concerns that the U.S. could rapidly upgrade its strategic defenses retaliatory or first strike. Others could impact crisis stability. A few hypersonic glide vehicles, for example, if undetected, could pose a decapitation threat to the U.S. Nuclear Command Authority. Russia is also modernizing its tactical nuclear weapons in numbers and types that give it about a 10-to-1 edge in non-strategic nuclear weapons. And this is very significant in light of the ongoing aggression against Ukraine, nuclear threats to U.S. allies, and Russian violation of the INF Treaty. And it's coupled with improvements in Russian conventional capabilities that give it a local superiority in the border regions. In addition, these deployments have been coupled with fears in the U.S. and Europe that Russia might be willing to use its nuclear weapons first for limited acts of aggression, not defense, against border states like the Baltics. In my view, and I've written on this, I think defense officials in both the Obama and Trump years over-egged their assessments of Russian military and the so escalate to win doctrine. But it is true that the president of Russia could order such nuclear employment as part of a coercive de-escalation campaign. And there's no question that there are facts on the ground in the expanding non-strategic nuclear weapons capabilities. So what can the U.S. and its allies do about this? I would suggest two aspects. Let me mention briefly so I can turn to some aspects of financial aspects of U.S. power. One counter for this contingency and a model of a low-cost improvement to U.S. limited nuclear options for extended deterrence was in 2019, the U.S. added a low-yield warhead to the U.S. submarine, Trident submarine force in a very smart, cost-effective move that bolstered tailored deterrence and allows the U.S. to credibly and decisively respond to any threat scenario posed by Russia. It would be even more advantageous and help impose costs if some of those response options allowed by this move were to hold at risk targets in the interior of Russia, encouraging them to divert forces and resources from their periphery to the interior. And the same goes for another development in 2019. The U.S. tested both a conventional medium-range ground-launched cruise missile and ground-launched ballistic missile, bringing back weapons into the arsenal that could lead to another cost-effective means to counter Russia, and I should add China's arsenal of ground-based conventional missiles, which are clearly designed to block U.S. access to forward operating spaces and NATO defensive operations against any Russian aggression. All right, so briefly on the other dimension of U.S. power that has both deterrent and coercive significance, it's important to note that although all three competitors, the U.S., Russia, and China, are nuclear powers, only the United States possesses a unique economic and financial arsenal of capabilities. And this is thanks to the dominance of the US dollar and the centrality of US economic and financial system to international commerce. It's important to note here that the relative capability advantages of the United States are greater financially than economically. This is important in light of the next panel, which is going to focus on China, which is a rising economic powerhouse, but not an international currency powerhouse. This is so, we know, because most international trade is settled in dollars. The US has the largest financial markets and clearinghouse banks, and of course the US dollar is the dominant reserve currency, and half of global debt is issued in US dollars because dollar-denominated debt markets are deep, liquid, and rule-governed. So one could think maybe about a future where China could internationalize the RMB and increase its role in international payments as a unit of account in a trading bloc that China dominates. But it's not conceivable for Russia in the sense that the Russian ruble bloc was a Cold War relic and cannot be resurrected given Russia's reduced economic and currency footprint. Now, the dominance of the dollar allows the US to weaponize finance as a powerful alternative to military engagement. And Tom has already talked about the use of sanctions, and US policymakers can also use dollar dominance to cut off access to the US financial system, to the global international payment system as well, by controlling choke points in that system. And so this is what the US has done repeatedly against Russia in response to its intervention and aggression in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, its use of chemical weapons, Novichok against individuals, and other wrongdoings. And then let me just mention briefly at the end three aspects of this kind of cost imposition strategy, and one that is quite useful and the least costly. I agree with Tom that punishment does not necessarily lead to coercive success. We're not likely to see Russia give up Crimea. It's also true that overuse of financial swords is encouraging competitors to try and diversify away from the dollar payment system. It's not possible yet, but it might be in the future. And the more we use this tool in ways that the rest of the world, including our European allies, finds offensive, the more we can expect the rest of the world to find such alternatives that would whittle down the influence of the US dollar internationally. And finally, extreme sanctions, and I mean those beyond even sectoral sanctions that we've leveraged against Iran, North Korea, and Russia, but the kind that would involve deliberate escalation risks and some inadvertent escalation risks, the so-called nuclear option of breaking another country's economy, which is, by the way, included in sanctions legislation passed by Congress but not implemented, is something to think again about. This idea was floated in 2014 and signaled to Russia that if Russia continued and expanded its aggression against Ukraine, that the United States would respond forcefully and use this so-called nuclear option to break the Russian economy. The Russians responded that would be war, and they have a number of escalatory counter responses, for example, or cyber attack on US infrastructure beyond using kinetic force. But what's interesting is what the Obama administration did, and I think this is the lesson to end with, which is the US switched from the logic of sanctions as a coercive punishment tool to the logic of a deterrent threat. So by signaling the financial so-called nuclear option of breaking the Russian economy, cutting it off from the dollar global international financial system if Putin significantly escalated the war in Ukraine with a large-scale invasion, thinking it could somehow seize Kiev in 2 weeks, then there would be dire consequences. And the US could respond together with its allies across multiple domains, including breaking the Russian economy. We don't know exactly why Russia didn't go all the way in Ukraine. There are a number of other factors that should be taken into account, including domestic interests and fear of concern of getting into a costly attritional war that might threaten the survival of Putin's regime. But it's also possible that this deterrent threat was one of the considerations. And it's worth keeping in reserve for these kinds of exceptional circumstances, but not overusing it. I think that's a good place to stop. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Our next speaker is Alexander Linoshka.
Can you see me all right?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for having me as part of this virtual conference. It's very nice to reconnect with the Modern War Institute. So in preparation for this event, Professor Sherlock asked me to talk about the resilience of NATO as a deterrent against various forms of Russian aggression. What steps can NATO take to improve its posture and to prevent a future fait accompli action? And what could NATO countries do to impose costs to roll back aggression or block such behavior in the future? So I think to answer these questions, I believe it is important to consider the most dangerous and most likely scenarios that involve Russian military aggression, and basically organize an analytical framework around these scenarios. So the most dangerous scenario, unsurprisingly, envisions some sort of military assault against NATO territory. Now, short of a bolt out of the blue nuclear strike that no one really takes seriously, the absolute most dangerous scenario here involves a large-scale territorial advancement into one of or some of the Baltic countries. But most Baltic defense watchers would argue that this sort of scenario has a very low probability, that such an action would entail great risk because it could generate escalatory dynamics that can easily slip beyond Moscow's control and thus create massive costs when the potential political gains are very dubious. After all, Russia already has access to a warm water port on the Baltic coast by way of the Kaliningrad exclave, if these things still matter. And so a more reasonable, dangerous scenario is one in which Russia seizes in some sort of fait accompli action towns lying close to the Russian border in either Latvia or in Estonia. Towns that feature a relatively large ethnic Russian or Russophone populations. Now, to be clear, I do not have in mind a scenario in which Russia seizes pockets of NATO territory just for the sake of testing the alliance's will or resolve. Again, I think that runs too high of a risk for Russia to undertake, and certainly that sort of action will undermine its status and its standing in international politics much further for very questionable political gain. A more plausible scenario is that under the banner of its compatriot policy, Russia might use local turmoil that arguably place ethnic Russians or Russophones at risk or in danger so as to justify taking a small town or city like the Estonian city of Narva on defensive grounds. Of course, a number of studies have come out in recent years to show that Russian influence in such minority populations in Estonia and in Latvia has actually declined over the course of the last 30 years. Although Russophones might sympathize with Russian foreign policy or express fondness for Russia itself, such sentiments do not translate into a willingness to participate in subversive activities that could facilitate a Crimea-like or Donbass-like operation in any of those countries. Despite the problems posed by their stateless status, a problem that has been mitigated in recent decades, their integration in local economic and political affairs has been steadily increased. And certainly being part of the European Union is helpful. Still, the worst case scenario may be unlikely and may not necessarily and should not necessarily dominate our thinking on these questions. We cannot necessarily dismiss these possibilities either. Few, after all, expected the annexation of Crimea, much less the war in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. They did not expect these sorts of things to happen, and so territorial conquest of any sort cannot be completely ruled out as a possibility. Now, moving along, the most likely scenario involving Russian aggression is one that we've already been seeing across NATO. Now, I have in mind here so-called hybrid actions in and around the Baltic littoral region, as well as elsewhere in the alliance. Now, I personally don't really like using the modifier hybrid anymore, but for the sake of discussion, let's consider hybrid tactics to mean those subversive activities that fall short of the threshold of war. Subversive activities that can include airspace incursions, disinformation campaigns, intelligence activities, fomenting ethnic grievances, interference in political institutions, and interference in election cycles. I won't speak about disinformation campaigns at all because, of course, Jankowicz will do so. But my personal view here is that the real threat of disinformation is largely domestic rather than foreign, and that in this space, at least, we see the Baltic countries address these sorts of concerns with some dexterity. And indeed, what sort of steps can NATO do to prevent or to mitigate these sorts of scenarios from taking place? First, I think we need to acknowledge that NATO has actually proven rather resilient and adept in the last 6 years. None of the worst case scenarios have come to pass, and the most likely scenarios that are indeed happening still seem to be managed. Those Baltic countries are well anchored in Western institutions like the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, despite what political domestic controversies that they might have at home. At least in the pre-COVID era, the threat environment was seen as much more manageable than what had been the case in the immediate aftermath of Crimea and other Russian activities in and around Ukraine in 2014. Second, I think as much as land grabs are unlikely, they cannot be entirely discounted considering the record of Russian behavior. And as such, several capabilities, I believe, are important and worthy of investment. Now, none of this precludes the sort of dialogue that that Dr. Graham had proposed in his set of remarks. And indeed, having these sorts of capabilities can thread the needle nicely between deterrence and reassurance as regards to both allies and adversaries. But these capabilities can include the following. One is improved intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to promote or perform what Thomas Mankin and his co-authors have labeled deterrence by detection, preventing hostile action from taking place by being able to discover it and to expose covert activities that are malign in nature. To this effect, the United States has, through its enhanced defense agreement with Poland signed recently, agreed to deploy a number of drones in order to augment early warning capabilities. That is just one example of how one can go about improving ISR in this region. A second set of capabilities, and perhaps a little more controversially, is to develop a suite of missile capabilities at various ranges within the European theater. There are several motivations for doing so. One is that Russia has indeed invested in precision strike capabilities that could isolate targets and units on the battlefield, even providing it with greater confidence in going about various subversive activities that do fall well below or even just below the threshold for war. Now, there is no need to match Russia missile for missile in light of the threat assessment I had just given. But now that the INF Treaty is behind us, countries can invest in capabilities that do hold at risk Russian assets by way of using, say, theater range, ground-based land attack, road mobile, conventional missiles in parts of Central and Northeastern Europe, as well as anti-ship missiles that can hold off the Russian Navy in the Baltic Sea. And to some extent, we're already seeing this development play out in some NATO countries like Poland, for example. And indeed, given the evidence that we've been seeing in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we see that the Armenian military has insufficiently integrated short-ranged air defenses in order to give their armor sufficient force protection. There's going to be a premium certainly placed on SHORAD, especially for countries like Poland, in light of the growing drone threat that Russia could pose in the foreseeable future. Third, and finally, we should continue to pay attention to those potential fait accompli and what hybrid scenarios we believe to be most serious in this particular environment. Now, one problem with the NATO ground presence in the Baltic region, and I speak here of the enhanced forward presence, whereby NATO countries have agreed to deploy 4 battalion-sized battle groups in the 3 Baltic countries and Poland. The problem with those battle groups, in some ways, as regards to the fait accompli issue, is that they're massed in places where a Russian invasion force, again, in a very unlikely scenario in which they would, in fact, invade those countries, could, in fact, avoid them and circle around them and even isolate them. They're not necessarily dispersed in places that we believe could be vulnerable to a limited fait accompli. And so having local tripwires in place where faits accompli are possible is important for the tripwire to indeed live up to its name. You have to indeed trip over that wire. Still, those battle groups by design cannot nor do not deal with the most likely scenario of Russian aggression by way of those hybrid tactics that I just described. These issues tend to fall under national ambit. And so for that, we must help those countries help themselves, because much of the problem that could arise with, say, members of the local ethnic Russian or Russophone population do stem from domestic political issues, in particular issues relating to their lack of integration and so forth. But again, I think it's very important to emphasize that most members of these minority groups do not wish to subvert the countries in which they reside. Indeed, they aspire to become much more integrated as a result. On that note, I think we're actually on the right track. I think NATO has proven rather resilient. And so with some adjustments, I think we can still shore up certain gaps in our deterrent posture. Thank you.
Alexander, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Nina Jankowicz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sherlock, and thanks to the organizers for having me today. It's a delight to be here, and I think all of those 3 presentations are tough acts to follow, particularly on today, where I think we're all operating on very little sleep. So I'm going to try to keep this short and snappy, and really look forward to discussion and questions. So I was asked to talk a little bit about Russia's goals in waging information warfare and its capacity to do so, look at some of the successes and failures of past information operations, and then talk a little bit, of course, about coercion and deterrence. And just as a hint of what's to come, I think I share some of the views that have been expressed already, and I do think we actually need to look inward rather than thinking about this as completely a coercive game, particularly when it comes to information operations. So first, Russia's goals. I kind of see these goals as 3 prongs. The first 2 prongs are related. First, the goal is to undermine distrust in democratic systems, whether in the West writ large or specifically here in the United States. We've seen Russia use information warfare that affects both sides of the political spectrum, although it tended to help one candidate in the past, and in the current information operations that we're seeing in this election period, it is something that is targeted at both liberals and conservatives, and this holds true to some of the patterns we've seen in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe as well. why does Russia want to undermine our democracies and create that distrust? The idea, as I said, is two-pronged. So first, keeping us preoccupied domestically, keeping us looking at our internal problems, gives Putin a bit of a carte blanche in his own foreign policy, keeps us distracted while he engages in whatever he's going to engage in his near abroad and even further afield. We've seen, of course, Russian operations in the Central African Republic, in Venezuela, and in several other places as we've been distracted at home. Of course, Syria is another one that comes to mind. But it also boosts Putin domestically, right? If he has protesters on the street in somewhere like Khabarovsk, as he's been dealing with all summer and into the fall, he can say to those folks who are demanding a more democratic form of governance, is that what you really want? Look how well it's working out in the United States, that shining city on a hill. Look how well their democracy is going right now. And indeed, we've seen some of that whataboutism over the past several months as we have dealt with the coronavirus crisis and stumbled in many cases, and as we've dealt with the unrest related to the killing of George Floyd and the protests related to the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, you know, the abuses of journalists, things like that, that Russia and Russian state media just latched onto that immediately, as we knew they would. And that's something that really, again, does boost Putin at home. The third goal, and I think this is something that Russia has been fairly successful at least vis-a-vis the United States, is getting Russia a seat, a more permanent seat back at the global negotiating table. Now, you'll say, of course, you know, Russia's been kicked out of the G8, but I will remind you, very recently, both President Trump and Emmanuel Macron of France have been entertaining the idea that we might bring Russia back into the G8, despite the fact that Russia was kicked out for its illegal annexation of Crimea, and Crimea is still in Russian hands. We're considering that. Putin and Trump very famously, you know, had their presser in Helsinki, that summit, which I frankly think is not something that should have happened with such great pomp and fanfare. That, again, lifts Putin up in the eyes of his domestic audience. These sorts of things are really important for you know, improving Putin's stature at home and on the world stage, and we know that's something that Putin has been angling for many years. And the final thing that I would add there is that over the past 4 years, has there been a week that Russia has not been in the news here in the United States? Even if it's, you know, as the big bad baddie, that's something that is, you know, beneficial to Putin at home. So I think we are in that way allowing Putin a win, even though that we've seen here haven't been incredibly effective. These information operations have had that kind of reflexive effect where we're elevating Putin and the Russian Federation writ large to a status that perhaps it doesn't deserve given the economic and military power that it has at hand. Now, that being said, I have cast a little bit of doubt on the efficacy of Russian information warfare. I still do think it is an exigent national security threat, and one that we've abdicated our responsibility in attempting to solve over the past few years. And I'm happy to take questions about this election period a little bit later on. I'm going to leave that out of my remarks today, though. What are some successes that we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years in the West? And more broadly, I would cite the information operations and kind of further influence operations in Georgia, beginning in 2018, or sorry, 2008. There we go. In the 5-day war, which, you know, that initial information operation, clashes between the Saakashvili government and Putin and Medvedev in the international media space was a loss for Russia, but it encouraged Russia. And in fact, Margarita Simonyan is on record saying that she felt that Russia looked so pale in comparison to the Georgians. And that's when they began to start really investing more in their international media apparatus, both in RT and, you know, the information operations that we're seeing today that have, you know, gone through that entire period. But Russia doesn't only operate in the disinformation sphere, not only in the online sphere or the mainstream media sphere. In Georgia, especially since the return of the Georgian or the coming to power of the Georgian Dream government several years ago, 2015, 2016, we have seen a reemergence of Russian cultural influence in Georgia that kind of acts as a vector for the informational angle. So while the Saakashvili government was very clear about the threat that Russian information operations posed. You know, they invested in Russian language broadcasting for minority populations and things like that. The Georgian Dream government came in and undid all of that, and frankly opened up many of the cultural vectors that allow that informational influence. So not only trade and economic policy that they've increased over the past several years, but also the Ruski Mir Foundation, which is quite active in Georgia, as well as a few Orthodox organizations that allow Russian influence in. And as a result, what we're seeing is rising Russian influence during the Georgian Dream period in Georgia, despite the fact that the national security doctrine of Georgia clearly states, as it should, given that 20% of Georgia is still occupied by Russia, that you know, Russia is an informational and clearly an exigent national security threat. So I think that that has been a long-term success for Russia. And to some extent, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, you could argue in different contexts that there is some informational success there as well. I'm not going to go into the details of the early information war in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. I think this audience probably knows them very well. But one thing that I will say that I think is very interesting and holds some lessons for the United States today is I was in Ukraine covering the presidential election last year in 2019. And frankly, I was supposed to be there looking for Russian disinformation, and we didn't find very much. And that's because, in some degree, Ukraine has so much of its own internal polarization that all Russia had to do was amplify that existing domestic discord. Now, I think that should sound very familiar to our American audience today. And it will bring me eventually to what I'm talking about with our solving our internal problems before we start to play whack-a-troll. But what I think is successful about the information strategy that Russia has had in Ukraine, despite just the fact that it's amplifying those internal divisions that in some cases are of Ukraine's own making, is that Russia's gotten very good at identifying those divisions in society. It's not that it is making quote unquote fake news, even though that is in the subtitle of my book. I had some words with my publisher about it, but they wanted to keep it in there. Really, the best disinformation is not about cut and dry fakes. It is about real emotional, visceral reactions, real grievances in society. And Russia's great at identifying them. And it's not necessarily that it's, got some evil geniuses in some content creation laboratory in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. It's that the tools of social media allow Russia to basically throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks over time, and then keep throwing that same sticky spaghetti at exactly the target audience that is going to find it most appetizing at any given time. That's what social media has allowed Russia to do. And of course, Russia's active measures campaigns during the Soviet period were successful in many ways in identifying those fissures as well. But social media opens up a whole new scale of that activity. As Dr. Linoshka laid out, I do believe that Russia has failed by and large in the Baltic states with its influence operations, perhaps with a slight exception to Latvia. I think Estonia and Lithuania, both places where I've done fairly extensive research, have shown that resilience building within their societies is a great way to push back against Russian aggression. Of course, they have increased their cyber capabilities, and Lithuania, is a strong advocate for new Europe in the European Union and within NATO. All of that's incredibly important, but when we look at what they've done to increase resilience by increasing educational and career opportunities for Russian-speaking populations, by building a new European identity rather than a cultural or linguistic Baltic identity, the statistics and also a lot of the sociological interviews that I've done over the past several years indicate that things are moving in the right direction, that those are more resilient societies, that people are skeptical to the information that is being targeted at them. And that's exactly what we would want to see in the United States. And frankly, those identities, those societies have become more resilient, more cohesive as a direct result of Russian information aggression. So what should the United States do to weaken Russia's capacity and its will to engage in information warfare and similar behaviors? The first thing I think we need to understand is that these campaigns have an extremely high return on investment. They are very, very cheap, both in terms of human and monetary resources. And given that the costs that we've imposed so far are fairly low, there's really no reason for Russia not to keep making these investments. We know that the Internet Research Agency in 2018, for example, was spending about $12 million per year. That included all of its operating expenses and staff time and things like that. Really a very small sum of money. And just as an example, I'm in the middle of an investigation right now looking at a cash for comments scheme that's been going on over the past couple of weeks, trying to increase support for the Crimean independence movement. And that, even though it had about 8,000 comments that so far that I've tracked down on Instagram, and it encompasses about 2,400 accounts, cost $5 to run. And it, was spamming all of these quite high-profile accounts with comments about Crimea. Not very effective, but again, easy investment to make. You can almost just, think about it and shrug it off if it doesn't work. Now, as I said, I know this is a panel about coercion and deterrence, but I am frankly not convinced of the efficacy of the post-2016 sanctions that we've imposed on Russia for its information operations, because again, the cost has been, the cost benefit is, it just doesn't make sense. Russia is going to continue to make those investments. They are so small until we work perhaps more in concert with our European allies on these things. And, I definitely agree with some of the suggestions that have been made before about the ways to escalate and when to escalate, but not to over-escalate. I think we need to rethink these, and the next administration should do a thorough review of sanctions policy before blindly extending some of the sanctions that we have in place. I also agree with Dr. Graham that perhaps congressionally mandated sanctions aren't the best way to go. I think, given the situation that we were in with this administration and its lack of political will to address Russia, it was perhaps what Congress had to do, but I hope that gets reconsidered in the next Congress. But as I said, important to draw red lines, especially to do so in cooperation with our allies, where I think this administration has been absolutely lacking with our allies in Europe. But we need to do this clearly, and I think it is, it behooves the next administration to sit down with Russian leadership early on and have a frank conversation about what's going on, because that hasn't really happened yet. We need to lay it out there and say, let's come to an agreement about this, or here are what the consequences are going to be. Give them an out, but not send an incongruent message, which is what we've been doing. We hear some administration officials talking about how bad election interference is. Meanwhile, we're seeing many of the same tactics used domestically at home. And then we have a message from the White House about how much President Trump admires Putin, et cetera, et cetera. That's way too much of a mixed message on an issue that should be fairly clear cut. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we can't just play whack-a-troll with this. It's not just a Russia problem. It's becoming a China and Iran problem as well. And just because the Kremlin might stop using these operations at some point doesn't mean other adversaries won't engage in them. And that's when it comes back to us. We really need to create a more resilient society. We need to fill the gaps, those societal fissures that are being exploited by our adversaries. And frankly, that's all to the detriment of our democracy, that we are not looking inward to solve this stuff. And so there's a couple things that we can do. We need to start thinking beyond the traditional national security bubble when we speak about how to fight influence operations. And I think the British government has done a really good job about this. They have a fusion doctrine, which has had some bumps along the road, but essentially it has brought, all of the UK government to bear when they're dealing with influence operations, whether it's been the Skripal poisoning or, the Russia report, things like that. So creating that whole of government response, really important, but also looking inward at our own people, looking at how to build media and digital literacy, investing in journalism as a public good. Basically, the bottom line is that a strong, democratic, and equitable United States is a much more dangerous adversary than one that is simply engaging in a coercive, basically deterrent posture constantly. Our democracy, our openness is our strength, and that's what we need to start investing in over the next couple of years. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nina. We are facing sort of a time dilemma. We have around 15 minutes left. What I would like to do is not entirely split the difference, but at least take 5 minutes for one of my own questions, and then we'll go to questions right after that. So I ask whoever answers this question from the panel that you be as brief as possible. Maybe we could get in 2 responses. And so the question would be, and to poach a little bit on the next panel, the question of Sino-Soviet relations. When we look at the challenge that Russia presents to the West, obviously Sino-Russian relations is a key component in evaluating what that challenge, the extent of that challenge. So the question would be, how close is their strategic relationship in the short to midterm, that is Sino-Russian? And what can the United States do to disrupt the ties that bind the 2 countries closer together? And would anyone like to take that?
I'll jump in briefly, Tom, if you want.
Okay.
Since I actually raised it initially in my earlier remarks. Here, looking at this question, it is, I think, one of the most dangerous potentially going forward, and one that the U.S. has underestimated. We constantly focus on how it's not in Russia's long-term interest to become not only a junior partner of China, since it didn't want to be a junior partner of the United States, but also the risks to Russia of a rising China. And in the long run, that's right. But in the short and medium run, in fact, the deepening of the Chinese-Russian relationship, especially in the military component, and not just the military component in energy and economics, is important. Putin, of course, characterized this relationship in 2019 as an allied relationship in the full sense of a sort of strategic partnership. There's extensive defense cooperation in terms of exercises, arms sales, even the building of an early warning system, which is why I suggested that a true full-blown alliance would be a major threat to the United States and represents a failure of U.S. policy. Frankly, I don't think there's a lot we can do about it in the short run, because the U.S. is unwilling to give Russia what it would want. And we need to focus more, I think, as the other panelists have suggested, on improving the U.S. economy, U.S. global interests, U.S. leadership and institutions, and relations with allies. And this is not going to give us the chance to try and pull Russia out of this. It may be, though, that Russia and China are in kind of their Rapallo stage, if you think back in the 20s of Russia-German relations. And we certainly don't want to see Russia go all the way to the 39 stage. So it's something we should think about ways to obstruct going forward. But I don't think there are a lot of mechanisms at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for raising Rapallo. Interesting blast from the past. Anyone else would like to weigh in on Sino-Russian? Yes, Tom.
I'll just very briefly. First, we shouldn't have a set of policies that drive Russia closer to China. I think something that we've done unthinkingly over the past 4 or 5 years. And second, one of the reasons for diplomatic engagement with Russia and renewing that is that you provide Russia with another outlet, another possible strategic partner. Now, I'm not arguing that this is going to be copacetic, that we're going to become partners, but in the absence of strategic alternatives, Russia can only move towards China. That, I would argue, is not to our benefit.
Okay, thank you. So let me turn to the audience, and I ask you to please raise your hand and turn your camera on and direct your questions to either the panel as a whole or to an individual panelist, please. Any questions from the audience? And just raise your hand, please, and then turn your camera on so we can identify you. Okay, I see no one at the moment, so maybe I'll just fill the space.
Hi, Tom. This is Charlie Fate. There's a question from Leif Rosenberger in the comment section. If you can't see it, I can read it to you.
Thanks very much.
Okay. This is from Leif Rosenberger. He says it's a question for Cynthia Roberts. It reads, the Sino-Russian Energy Partnership. Is the Sino-Russian Energy Partnership a major setback for U.S. great power economic competition? And does it mean that the U.S. is now the odd man out in the Sino-Russian U.S. strategic triangle?
Well, to the extent I understand the question, we already agreed that the U.S. in this strategic triangle is now the weaker link, and it was, as Tom I think alluded to, a strong point when the U.S. had better relations, even though they were strained in the Cold War with both the Soviet Union and China, than they had with one another. In terms of energy, it's a natural link between Russia and China, and the Chinese, Xi Jinping actually helped bail out the Russians after the sanctions and the collapse of energy prices, in the sense of fronting some of the financing for Rosneft and some of these energy activities, and also buying oil and gas from Russia. So this is not good. It's not in the U.S. interest. But again, it's there's a limit to how much we can sanction this. And to bring it to Europe, I think it's worth noting that my sense is trying to impose further sanctions on the Germans because of the pipeline with Russia. Whatever one thinks of that pipeline, it's going to go forward. Trying to get a commercial gain for the United States out of this, I think, is the wrong way forward. I would much rather have the Germans contribute actively to NATO defense, stand up a division, host U.S. capabilities like the kinds of ground-based missiles that both Alexander and I mentioned, that would help deter Russian aggression in the unlikely event that Putin decides to attack an Article 5 treaty member of NATO. So, yeah, that's what I would throw it on this. Tom may have other points. That is Tom Graham. I'm sorry.
If you do not, I'll ask Colonel Fane Charlie, if you see anyone else in chat, let me know. Otherwise, we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to divide the remaining time, just a minute or so each, and ask each of you, let's say if Biden is elected, all right, we probably won't know for some time who is the new president, but how will Russo-American, how will the relationship change if Biden is elected? I think Tom Graham hinted at what he expected if that course takes place. But would you like to finish your point, Tom, or?
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted. Oh, I'm sorry. That's true. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
You
Okay.
can.
Very, very quickly. First, I think that we will establish a dialogue on strategic stability. The Biden administration will certainly extend the New START agreement, launch a sustained dialogue on strategic stability. It also would want to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. That is something that Russia would see as positive, although they probably try to squeeze something out of us in order to get that done. A Biden administration will be, I think, more engaged on issues in the former Soviet space, particularly Ukraine, given Biden's own experience there. That's going to be a downside for Russia, but a dialogue that we need to have. The second point I would make here is that I think we need to remember that a Biden presidency is going to be focused initially largely on domestic political issues. That's the reason, if he's elected, that he will be elected for that: pandemic, the economy, and so forth. This means that the important part of the foreign policy is going to be conducted by people whose names we don't know at this point: Secretary of State, a National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and so on. Where they will take relations is an open question. Finally, I do think that the Biden administration will be pragmatic. I think you'll see more diplomatic engagement. And as I said in my remarks, this doesn't mean that we're going to be friends. but this is a way of trying to send the appropriate messages. In fact, it's a part of deterrence, right? We'll send clear messages to Russia, what our goals are, what our expectations are, and what the consequences are if Russia ways highly to those interests.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes for 3 quick responses. We'll go with Cynthia, Alexander, Nina.
I agree with what Tom has said. I think there'll have to be more focus on diplomatic engagement, and there will probably be more on China, although Biden is more oriented toward focusing on European relations. I think that would be a mistake. I think the Europeans need to do more themselves in supporting Euro-Atlantic relations. But I think the Biden administration also needs to be cautious about this balance of trade-offs between costs, coercion, and deterrence, and finally, the real budgetary constraints we're going to face. So any cost-imposing strategies on our adversaries need to not cost us more. They have to cost us less, and we have to be very careful about those factors. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Alexander.
So I agree with my co-panelists that there'll be greater pragmatism characterizing the Biden administration's approach to Russia if it were indeed to be elected. However, I think the underlying tensions or issues within that relationship are very severe all the same. So after all, we spent the last several years talking about Russian malfeasance and malign behavior, especially in the context of the 2016 presidential election. So I agree that the interagency process will be much more improved and there'll be greater pragmatism and much less schizophrenia, but I still think there'll be sufficient wariness towards Russia to truly meaningfully undertake any sort of major cooperative endeavor. There will not be any sort of reset of the sort that we've seen in previous administrations. And with respect to other issues like in the nuclear domain, verification problems will remain quite severe, especially as the United States is still trying to go about its nuclear modernization program. And so in that setting, the United States might feel a bit of a disadvantage vis-a-vis Russia on some of these issues, and that could have effects on the alliance as well. So again, there will be more pragmatism, less schizophrenia, and those things are good unto themselves, but I think you're not going to be necessarily entirely rosy days ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Nina, you have the last word.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just highlight 2 areas where I think we are going to see some roadblocks. I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said so far. First, I think we're going to see the Biden administration stand up a whole of government response to information operations, and I think it's likely that will either be headquartered as an NSC directorate or potentially within the Department of Homeland Security. But we are going to see a much more joined up interagency response on disinformation, which is going to mean more costs for Russia and other malign actors. So that will be a continued roadblock to further, improved diplomatic relations. The second thing that I think can't be left out of the equation, although I know we are looking at kind of a defense and national security view here, is that the Biden administration is really going to double down on support for budding democracies around Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. We know this has been a priority of Vice President Biden's from day one. He's going to hold a transatlantic democracy forum, and these are the sorts of activities that Russia sees, frankly, as meddling in its own internal affairs. So I think we'll continue to see that play a role in some of the difficulties going forth in U.S.-Russian relations. And again, thanks for having me. It's been great to be with you today.
Well, I'd just like to thank the panel as a whole. Great working with you. Very, very stimulating questions. A lot of problems ahead.